File Services Part 3. In this nugget, we're talking about File Services Part 3, where we'll address the encrypting file system. We'll start with a functional description so that you can see how the encryption and decryption works, and it really relates to a certificate. And then we'll take a look at a demo on how to do this as well. We'll actually encrypt a folder and the contents thereof, and we'll see who can decrypt it. We'll also take a look at the data recovery agent. This is a critical role to be able to set up in advance prior to doing any encryption so that you can always have kind of a backdoor to be able to decrypt those files with a specific user account. And you can use more than one, but a specific user account that can always kind of, break glass in case of emergency to decrypt documents. Also, we'll take a look at CA Autoenrollment, not because it's part of the exam objectives, but because we'll be working with certificates a lot, and I kind of think that you should have some awareness of how auto-enrollment works, and so that you can use it for yourselves with your EFS solutions. I remember when I was a kid, my sister had a diary that had a tiny lock on it so that it could prevent people from opening it up and reading about all of her secrets. Well, not wanting to be outdone by a challenge, I fashioned a paper clip together one day and figured out how to open up that rudimentary lock that was on that diary and open it up. And I wasn't really concerned about what was inside of it. I just wanted to see if I could open the lock, which I did. Which I also showed my sister that I could do a couple of days later and let her know that I had been able to do so for a couple of days. Well, she became very paranoid and upset that I had read all of her secrets. I'm not quite sure what was in there, because I didn't actually read anything. But I didn't tell her that. All along, and even probably to this day, she thinks that I have some deep, dark secrets on her, which is probably also how I've always been able to get my way ever since then. Cue the wicked laugh. See, you thought I was a nice guy, didn't you? But you were wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I've never really leveraged it against her. But at the time, at least, it was quite funny and comical to my side of things anyhow. Well, you see, we have certain things that are precious to us. It could be company data. It could even be personal data. And there are a number of ways of protecting it, such as using NTFS permissions that we looked at a couple of nuggets ago. But there's also the ability to use additional methods, such as the encrypting file system. And here, we're going to take a look at what this can do for you. So, to protect our secrets in a Windows environment, we don't use a little tin lock and key. Instead, we use the encrypting file system. And what happens here is we'll have something called a file encryption key, or FEK, which will encrypt the file. This is a symmetric key, meaning that the same key is used to encrypt the data as to decrypt the data. Normally, this is not considered very secure, because if anybody can get a hold of that symmetric key, then they can always decrypt the data, right? So what happens here is Microsoft has decided to use it anyway because it performs very, very fast, and we don't want to have a performance hit on EFS. But to protect that symmetric key, so it's not just bare and easily accessible, Microsoft wraps that key with the user's public key, and this requires a certificate for the user. A user certificate has both a public key and a private key. All right. Now, this is best when configured out of using a PKI, or a public key infrastructure, so that you have a managed certificate distribution that you can control. Otherwise, if a user encrypts a file or a folder without a PKI, then it will generate a self-signed certificate, and then for troubleshooting and administration, you have to manage all the certificates on all your clients' machines individually, and that becomes very unwieldy very quickly. Now, like I said, they will wrap the FEK in the user's public key, but then it gets unwrapped and exposed so that it can decrypt data, but it gets unwrapped by using the user's private key. Okay, so that's what we have there. This is also a very secure method for security. I mean, once it's encrypted, unless you can log on as that user, you're not going to be able to get to that data. Some old versions of the 40-bit export version of Windows 2000 has been cracked using some supercomputers, but the current versions of EFS use at the very least 128-bit encryption, and that's substantially harder, in fact, billions of times harder than the 40-bit encryption. And now the current Windows clients are going to be using 256-bit encryption, so it's extremely secure in that respect. There are still some vulnerabilities that you might want to keep in mind, though. If you open a file and that's encrypted, and then you decide to save it to a network destination or a different destination over the wire, in the transfer, that's still going to be unencrypted. So if you're concerned about somebody sniffing the wire, they could still potentially pick that up. Also, it's only as strong as the user's password, because when the user logs on, it exposes their certificate, which contains the public and private key. So if someone else can guess their user's password or crack it somehow and log on as that user, then they also have access to that user's public and private key so that they can encrypt and decrypt whatever they want. All right, let's take a look at how this stuff actually works. You see, here I've logged on as building 1 user 01, and I've got a folder here called EFS data, which contains my deepest, darkest secrets that I don't want anybody else to know about, right? So how can I encrypt its contents? Well, I could right-click on individual files and choose to encrypt them, but usually it's more practical if we encrypt entire folders at once, because that will also encrypt any temporary files that get created inside of them and help to secure them so that they're not leftover fragments that can also be exploited. But I'll go to the properties of this folder, choose Advanced, and then encrypt the contents to secure the data, and OK and OK. Then I'm going to apply the changes to the folders, subfolders, and files, meaning that all contents of this folder will now be encrypted, and we can see that indicated in the green color of this folder. And then in a little bit of self-imposed revenge for my sister, I'll put in here my high school diary, okay? So there's my high school diary, and we open this up, and, today I dreamed that I made the varsity football team and started dating the cheer captain. Actually, I did one better than that. I made the captain of the chess team, and I did marry the cheer captain, in fact, okay? So I did pretty good there. So anyway, that's my confidential data that I don't want anybody else to know about. Now, let's explore this a little bit more. If I go back into the actual file now and go to its advanced properties, and then now notice there's a details button here. Now I see that it was indeed encrypted by my user account, and there's a certificate thumbprint over here as well. The certificate thumbprint is a unique identifier that identifies my certificate. Notice that if I have other people that I want to be able to see this as well, I can click on Add, and I can add any other certificates that are on this local machine and add them in here as well. This requires that they will have had to have logged on to this computer in the past and have generated a certificate. Either a self-signed certificate because there was no certificate authority in place, or one that was issued by a certificate authority. Either way, they have to have a certificate. If I just choose Find User and try to type in a user, for example, building 1 user 02, it looks like I can find the user, but as soon as I click OK, it's going to give me a problem. It says no certificates. So they do have to have a certificate somehow or another. I'm going to cancel this for the time being. Now here's a big problem. Down here it says recovery certificates for this file as defined by recovery policy. None. What this means is, if this particular user's profile gets corrupt, for example, their user profile, and maybe we have to delete it or reinstall the operating system or something, and maybe we lose their certificate, then this encrypted file will never ever get recovered. Okay, this could be permanently encrypted because the certificate is stored in that user profile. So that's something very important to keep in mind, especially because now, if I go back into this again, I don't have any recovery back here. Now, one other thing I could do is I could select on my account right here, my certificate, and I could choose backup keys, and then it will take you through a wizard, and you can save this to the file system. I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now, but it's pretty simple. You just next, finish through it, and then you can save it in a secure location. That way, if you ever do run into a problem where you lose the keys, you can recover quite nicely. So now we have an encrypted file and folder, but no way to recover it, no data recovery agent, or DRA as they're called. So I'm going to temporarily, at least, take encryption off of this because I don't really want to have it that way for the time being. And in fact, what I will usually do is I'll go back to my domain controller and I'll create an EFS policy, or I'll modify the default domain policy, and for the time being I'll just go to that. And what I'll do with this is I'll go into the Windows settings, security settings, and then I'll go into the public key policies and the encrypting file system. Here I'll right click to choose the properties of this, and I'll usually select don't allow encryption. Okay, if I have that capability or the authority to do this in any given environment, I will not allow encryption until my data recovery agents are fully configured and everything's been tested and I'm ready to roll, because otherwise someone might encrypt something that would then, maybe they would then lose their keys and we could never get that data back. So that's just something to keep in mind. So I'll come back to this in a little while and explain some of the options that you see there, but for the meantime, I want to go into this and define a data recovery agent. Now, a couple of ways of doing this. I could choose Add Data Recovery Agent. What that does is it allows me to browse for a user or a certificate. So I could browse the directory for Active Directory users, okay, and I could just find the user that I want to be my DRA, for example, and I'm going to, get out of this for the time being. Or I could, browse folders. And when I choose Browse Folder, what this is telling me is, I don't know why it gave me that. It's trying to look in a place that doesn't exist apparently, but this would look for a certificate that may have been exported and that I want to then select as the certificate that belongs to the user that can then act as my DRA. But I'm going to go back here, and actually I'll cancel this, and instead, if I want to use the DRA as my currently logged on user, and I'm logged on right now as the trainer account, and if that's who I want my DRA to be, then I can right click and choose Create Data Recovery Agent, and then it will just bring in my own certificate right here. Now you can see that I've got a certificate authority called DC Nugget 1 right here, and I've already installed it, offline. If I double click on this and look at the details of it, then I can see that there's a thumbprint for this. Usually I just identify the first few characters here to kind of get a mental picture of which one this is. And that's because it's possible for a user to log on to multiple locations and get new certificates at each one of those locations. I just want to kind of identify which one this is. Okay, so now we're ready to go. What I could do now is a couple of things. Number one, I want to do a GP update, and I'll just force this. Because since I've made a change to the default domain policy, I want the entire domain to be aware of that, and I'll need to go over to my client here as well and also make that change up here as well. So I'll do another GP update here as well, and it should then allow me to perform EFS encryption, but this time when I do it, it should also include the trainer account or the trainer certificate that's included in the data decryption field of the EFS file. And that will then allow me to recover any files or folders that users have encrypted. So now once again, I'm going to right click here, choose Properties, and then I'm going to go to Advanced, and I'm going to encrypt the contents to secure the data. And then I'll OK this again and do the same thing I did before. Now when I'll go into the actual file itself, when we choose its properties in Advanced, now when we go to Details, we'll see that there is indeed this trainer account, and it starts with those first characters that I told you about a little while ago. Okay, so I just wanted to identify that it's got the right certificate in there. That's just something that I do. So anyway, now we have that has been encrypted. Now the user themselves can log on here and open this up. Now what I want to do here next is to log on as one of the other users, like I don't know, building 1 user 02, and see if they can access that file. And we'll see that they can't because they're not added into the data decryption field. In other words, they don't have the encryption access to it. All right, now here I've logged on as, you can see, building 1 user 02. Now when I go to the computer and I try to access that same data here, they try to open up my high school diary, and they'll see access is denied. And that's not just because of NTFS permissions, that's because they don't have the encryption key that can decrypt this. You see, if I go to the properties of this, I should be able to read it just based on NTFS permissions because I'm a member of users, and I should have read and execute and read permissions, so I should be able to do so. But again, I can't because of what I just mentioned, that I do not have the proper certificate that has the private key that would decrypt that. Only building 1 user 01 does, and my trainer account. So now I'm going to go ahead and log on here again, this time as the trainer account, and we'll try to see if we can open that file. And so here I've logged on as that trainer account. You can see right here. Now I'll go to computer. I'm still not going to actually be able to open this file though, and I'll show you what I'll have to do for this. Here I'll go to open the EFS data, and again, not able to access the file. But let me show you why. The reason for that is because I don't actually have the certificate yet installed here. So if I go to All Programs, Administrative Tools, you'll see that I created a search MMC console at a previous point in time, and as I open that up, we'll see that I don't have a personal certificate here for my EFS recovery agent. So what I'll need to do is I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to edit this actually I've already got it open still. Edit this policy from my default domain policy, and this is where my EFS recovery agent is. Now I'm going to right click here to choose all tasks and export, and I'm going to save this to a file including, and this is important, the private key. Now this is also security sensitive. You don't want to export this key and then import it to a whole bunch of workstations scattered everywhere, because that private key is extremely security sensitive. What we'll normally actually do is we'll bring the file that is in question, the encrypted file, to an EFS recovery station where the user's certificate, the recovery agent certificate, is already been imported into that computer, and then they'll decrypt the file from there. And the reason for that is because we'll then have our DRA's recovery certificate on only one computer that we will physically secure, that we'll take other measures to make sure is very secure, instead of sending our exported private key to a number of other locations. So I'll enter a password here. I think they match. And then I'll enter in a name. And for this, I'm also going to just put it in a share so that I can access it from the other computer. And I think I've got a search folder here, so I'll just do that one. And I'll call it trainer, DRA. Okay. And then once that's been done and finished, now I can go over here to my Vista Client 01, and I can right-click here to choose all tasks and import. Or I could have located it through a UNC path or something, and then I could have just double-clicked on it. Either one of those would have worked. But I'll just do a whack DC nugget 1, and then search like this. And then I'll have to specify also that it's a PFX file. Okay, there's my trainer DRA. It's a PFX file, okay, which means the personal key can be stored in it. And then I'll click on Next and enter in the password. And then I'll click on Next. And I'll just put it in the personal certificate store and finish. Now I see the import was successful. There's the certificate itself. If I double click on it and look at the details, we'll see that the thumbprint is indeed the proper one, so I've got the right certificate. Now when I go to the EFS data, look, voila, I can now open up this high school diary and read the data within it. Now back over here on the policy itself, let's go back to our EFS properties, and I told you I'd talk to you about some of these items here. Now what I can do is choose allow. By default, they will all allow it unless there's a policy somewhere else in the hierarchy that disallows it, and then I can forcibly allow if I want to. Or I can just choose allow and then configure additional options here. So you could, for example, encrypt the contents of the user's documents folder. Got to be very careful about that, because certainly you can do that, but you definitely must make sure that you have your certificate authority infrastructure in place first, because now you're going to have broad scale encryption, and you got to really be prepared for that. Also, it might be overkill. There might not be security sensitive data in all of the documents folders. You also can require a smart card for EFS, and this would then require that you put the smart card into a smart card reader, and the certificate on that will then be usable for EFS. If it's been configured that way. And then you can create a caching-capable user key from the smart card. This means then that once I put my smart card in it, that I don't have to keep reinserting it. Once I insert it the first time, it'll cache that appropriate key material in memory and then continue to use it. I can enable page file encryption. This is only for extreme paranoia in terms of security, because it is conceivable that there is unencrypted data in a page file that a hacker might be able to access and derive sensitive information out of it. But it will take a huge performance hit to encrypt the page file. It's usually a large file, and it's encrypted, and that's going to be a performance penalty for you there. And if you have any changes to the keys, then you can also force it to display any notifications to you regarding that. Here's another one. This by default says allow EFS to generate self-signed certificates. I usually don't like that at all. I usually disallow that item because I want to make sure that any EFS encryption that occurs is only as a result of certificates that have been issued from my own certificate authority. And then when users do decide to use encryption, an EFS encryption for automatic certificate requests, and there's a basic EFS certificate that is available for them. So these are the basic settings for the encrypting file system by policy. So now to summarize some of those things that we just looked at there for EFS administration, remember a self-signed certificate is usually considered a bad thing because it's not bad in and of itself, but it makes management of EFS more difficult administratively. So a CA-issued certificate is normally going to be a good thing because then you can not only store the certificates also in Active Directory, in fact they can accompany the Active Directory users accounts if you configure them that way, but also because that can also issue my DRA certificate. certificate. And then there's also group policy object configuration, which I just showed you. I'll make sure you're somewhat aware of or familiar with all of the various options that you saw there. The data recovery agent is added to the data decryption field. That's what allows me to decrypt files that other users have encrypted. Also, with auto-enrollment, I don't have any extraordinary configuration that I need to do in order to make EFS work for the user side of things. Just when they log on, they'll automatically receive a certificate. If you can also set it up so that the computers receive certificates, which are not relative to EFS, but you can do that. And then that's pretty much easy. And auto-enrollment is a function that you can use with your certificate authority and a group policy object. Now, it's not really part of the exam, but when I talk about auto-enrollment, there's a lot of features there that really are not addressed in this exam, but you might want to be somewhat familiar with. So, just hang on with me, and I'm going to quickly go through this. You don't have to memorize all this, but I'll just give you some context for this. Well, I've installed an Active Directory certificate server. And within that, down here, we see that I've got some certificate templates issued. We'll notice that one of those is the user nlab. Now, where did that come from? That's not a default item. What I did was I went up to certificate templates, and I went to the user certificate. I right-clicked on it, and I chose duplicate template. When you do that, it'll give you an opportunity to name it, which I did, and I called it user nlab. And the key here is that I have to go to the security, and I have to choose for the domain users that I have the read, enroll, and auto-enroll permissions. All three of those permissions must be enabled in order for me to enable auto-enrollment, which prevents me from having to manually issue certificates somehow. That way the users just log on and they automatically get their certificates without much more work on my part. But the other thing I do have to do is to go into the group policy object. And you can see here that I've already created a group policy object to auto-enroll user and computer certificates for my users and computers. And then I go into the edit item here. And then under policies for the computer side of things, notice that I really didn't mess with the templates or anything for the user side of things. There's already a certificate template there that will work for the users. And also, by the way, let me go back up here. I forgot to show you one thing. On this, once I create my certificate template that I need, that was this, where is it? User nlab item. Then I have to go to certificate templates here, right-click, choose new, certificate template to issue. Once I've gotten here, then there's this, the certificate template that I can use. I already issued it, so it doesn't appear here a second time, but you'll just simply select the one you want, and it happens to be that one, and now it's available. But for the user side, for the computer side of things, then I also go to security settings, and then I go to public key policies, and then I'll go down here to select the certificate services client auto-enrollment, and I can just enable this. You can also optionally check a couple of additional items related to certificate expiration. And then for the automatic certificate request settings, you'll simply right-click here, choose new automatic certificate request, click next, and then identify the computer item, which I already did, and then I next finished. Then that's what appears here. And then for the user side of things, under policies, I'll go again under Windows settings, security settings, public key policies, and then go to certificate services client auto-enrollment. I'll again enable this and optionally set these options here as well, which you just saw me do. Now once you've done that, now you'll have the ability to automatically enroll. You might need to GP update to make sure that your clients will be aware of these new policies. And if they still don't get the policies, another thing you can do is, or rather, even if they get the policy but they're still not getting certificates, you can also go to a start search here and do a cert util-pulse. And that will tell it to seek out any certificates that it's supposed to have, and then it will receive those from their certificate authority. So, wow. I know that was a lot in a brief period of time, and I kind of went fast. But again, it's not part of the exam. I just want you to have that information there, just so that you have some sense of context on how these certificates are issued to the users, which is pertinent to EFS. In this nugget, we talked about file services. This was part 3 where we addressed the encrypting file system, which is a great way to encrypt documents for confidentiality. We took a look, first of all, at just kind of a functional description of it, and then we looked at how to actually perform encryption. Notice that just about any user can actually perform encryption unless you've prohibited it by policy. But if you don't already have a certificate authority structure in place and a DRA in place, then you could be in some trouble. So I also showed you how to set up a DRA so that they can recover those files for you. Also, it's going going to work out much more smoothly if you have certificate authority auto-enrollment in place. And we went kind of through that kind of quickly because it's not part of the exam objectives, but I thought that you should have some knowledge of how auto-enrollment works, and so I went ahead and showed it to you. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.